The wind that swept across the prairie outside Willow Springs on the morning of January 7, 1878, carried the bite of coming snow and the promise of a winter that would test every soul. Willow Springs was a wind-scoured stop in the Wyoming Territory, a day's ride north of the Union Pacific Rail line at Cheyenne. It was the kind of cold that found every weakness in a man's coat and settled into his bones like an ache that would never leave. The river ran sluggish and dark between its frozen banks, choked with shelf ice that groaned and cracked under its own weight. Along the western tree line, perhaps a quarter-mile from the scattered buildings that made up the town, a half-circle of Lakota teepees stood against the iron-gray sky. Their buffalo-hide walls were patched and smoke stained their peaks, sending up thin ribbons of pale smoke that the wind tore apart before they could rise above the cottonwoods. At the edge of the camp, pressed close to the timber, as if ashamed of its own existence, stood a log cabin. It was a crude structure thrown together from unseasoned timber and chinked with moss and frozen mud that had already begun to crack and fall away in places. The roof sagged under a thick layer of sod, and the single window was covered with oiled paper that rattled and tore in every strong gust. The door hung slightly crooked on leather hinges, and there was a gap at the bottom wide enough to let in field mice and bitter drafts. The cabin sat on a narrow strip of treaty ground land that belonged to no one because it belonged on paper at least to everyone, and no one at the same time. In the trampled snow between the cabin and the edge of town, 3 figures stood in a scene that would be dissected in every saloon and around every stove in Willow Springs for months to come. The first was Hyamovi, a Lakota warrior, 25 winters old, lean as a hunting wolf, and twice as watchful. He wore a buckskin shirt darkened by weather and campfire smoke fringed at the shoulders and decorated with a simple pattern of blue trade beads his mother had sewn on before the fever took her 3 years back. His hair hung in 2 tight braids wrapped with strips of red cloth, and across his shoulders rested a heavy wool blanket Canadian-made that he had won in a horse race the summer before the treaties started closing in. His face was all sharp angles and dark, unreadable eyes, the kind of face that had learned early not to give anything away to white men or their laws. In his right hand, held out flat with the palm open to the sky, lay a single silver dollar. The coin caught the weak winter light and threw it back cold and bright. Facing him was Silas Crawl, known up and down the freight roads and in every rough saloon from here to Cheyenne as Muddy Boots on account of the permanent crust of trail dust and worse that clung to his vest, his canvas trousers, and his cracked leather boots. He was a big man gone soft in the belly with a face like a slab of salt pork left too long in the sun, red, greasy, and pocked with old scars from knife fights and bar brawls he liked to brag about when he was drunk. His hands were thick and blunt, the nails black with grime that never seemed to wash out, and his eyes were small and mean, set too close together over a nose that had been broken more than once. He held a folded piece of paper in one fist and waved it like a man waving a winning poker hand. Between them, shivering in a dress, the color of dirty dishwater, stood a young woman. Her name was Liesel, though most people in Willow Springs just called her the deaf girl, when they bothered to call her anything at all. She was perhaps 20 years old, pale-skinned and thin in the way that spoke of too many missed meals and not enough hope to fill the hollow places. Her hair, the washed-out yellow of winter straw, was pulled back in a severe braid that hung limp down her back. Her eyes were a faded blue, and they stared straight ahead, at nothing, seeing everything and giving nothing back. Her hands red and chapped and covered with small burns, and cuts from hauling firewood and scrubbing floors hung loose at her sides. She did not look at Hyamovi. She did not look at Silas. She looked at the trampled snow and waited for whatever came next. A small crowd had gathered to watch because there was precious little entertainment in Willow Springs in the dead of winter, and a deal between a white freighter and a Lakota warrior was worth abandoning a warm stove to see. There were half a dozen teamsters and ranch hands stamping their feet and blowing on their hands a few townsmen with nothing better to do. and leaning against the hitching post outside the general store with his arms crossed and his tin star catching the light, Marshal Reginald Pike. Pike was a tall man, narrow through the shoulders and hips, with a face like a hatchet blade and eyes that never stopped moving, always cataloging threats and opportunities with the same cold efficiency. He had been marshal in Willow Springs for 3 years, and in that time, he had learned that the law was whatever a man with a badge and a gun said it was, as long as he said it loud enough and backed it up with lead when necessary. He watched Hyamovi the way a man watches a rattlesnake coiled too close to his boot, wary, calculating, ready to strike first, if it came to that. Standing slightly apart from the main crowd, leaning against the corner of the blacksmith shop, was a man called Black Tom. He was a drifter, perhaps 30 years old, with a scarred face and dead eyes that gave nothing away. He wore a long coat patched with mismatched fabric and carried a revolver on each hip. Men said he had ridden with outlaw gangs in Kansas and Missouri, and that he had killed at least 3 men in stand-up fights, maybe more from behind. He watched the transaction with the detached interest of a man watching chickens in a yard, calculating which one might be worth stealing later. His gaze drifted casually, as if by accident, to the leather money pouch hanging from Silas's belt and the one that bulged with the weight of coin. His tongue touched his lower lip just once, like a man tasting something he intended to have. Silas raised his voice, not because Liesl could not hear, though everyone believed she could not, but because he wanted every man standing in that frozen yard to hear him clear and bear witness. "This here girl owes me passage money from New York Harbor," he announced, tapping the folded paper for emphasis. "She owes me for boots, for feed, for a roof over her head when it rained, and for hauling her sorry backside across half this forsaken country in my wagon. I got the contract right here, signed legal and proper. She made her mark on it herself, or what passes for a mark when you are dealing with a deaf mute. Girl cannot pay what she owes, and she cannot work it off neither, on account of her being stone deaf and simple in the head to boot. So the debt transfers legal as the county seal. You want to take on this bad piece of business, warrior? I will sell you the contract for $1. You get her and the paper both, and I wash my hands of the whole wretched mess." Hyamovi said nothing. The wind tugged at his blanket and hissed through the dry grass that poked up through the snow. He looked at the contract, then at Liesl's bowed head, then at the cabin that sat on the fragile strip of ground his people were allowed to use for the winter under the latest treaty, the one that would be broken by spring, he had no doubt. The silence stretched out long enough that men began to shift their weight and glance at each other, wondering if the deal was going to fall through. Then Hyamovi stepped forward, as deliberate as a man stepping onto river ice he does not quite trust, and placed the silver dollar in Silas's outstretched palm. The coin clinked softly against the calluses. Silas grinned, his yellow teeth flashing like a dog's. He handed over the folded contract with a flourish, as if he were handing over the deed to a gold mine, instead of a piece of paper binding a broken woman to a lifetime of servitude. Hyamovi took the paper, and without a word or a flicker of expression, he tore it cleanly in half. The sound of ripping parchment was sharp and final in the cold air, louder than it had any right to be. He let the 2 pieces fall into the trampled snow at Silas's feet, where they lay like dead leaves. "She owes you nothing now," Hyamovi said in slow, careful English, each word clipped and precise. "The debt is finished." Silas's grin froze and twisted into something uglier. He bent to snatch up the torn halves, cursing under his breath, but Hyamovi had already turned his back and was walking toward the cabin. He did not touch Liesl, did not speak to her, just made a small gesture with his chin that meant, "Follow if you want to live." She did, moving stiffly like a woman whose joints had rusted over the long, hard months. The crowd muttered and shifted. Marshal Pike straightened slowly, his eyes narrowing to cold slits. Black Tom watched it all with those dead eyes, and when Silas stuffed the torn contract into his coat and patted the money pouch at his belt, checking its weight with the habit of a man who trusted nothing, Black Tom's gaze followed that gesture like a hawk watching a rabbit. He smiled faintly, a smile that never reached his eyes, then pushed off from the wall and walked toward the Lucky Dollar Saloon, already turning numbers over in his mind. Inside the cabin, Liesel stood with her back pressed against the door's arms wrapped tight around herself, as if she could hold her own body together by will alone. The interior was dim and cold, lit only by the weak gray light that filtered through the oiled paper window and the faint red glow of an iron stove that squatted in the center of the packed earth floor. The stove's door hung slightly open, and smoke leaked from the seams where the pipe met the crude hole cut in the roof, curling in lazy, poisonous spirals before being sucked back down by an errant draft. Hayamavai closed the door, dropped the heavy wooden bar across it, and crouched beside the stove. He studied it with the critical eye of a man who has survived more winters than he cares to count. "This fire is set wrong," he said half to himself. "We do not fix it, this place burns down around us by morning, or we choke before the sun comes up." Liesel turned her head slowly, watching his mouth shape the words. She hesitated, reading his lips, and then nodded once. "You understand me," Hayamovi said. It was not a question. She met his gaze, and after a long moment nodded again. "Good," he said. "Then help me fix this before we both freeze or burn." Hayamovi was no green youth. The scars along his ribs and the puckered mark on his left shoulder were souvenirs of the summer 3 years back, when he had ridden as a scout on the Blue Rock Plains, where Crow raiders and cavalry patrols moved through the tall grass like wolves, hunting the same ground. He had learned young that treaties were just words on paper, and paper burned as easily as dry grass. The cabin and the narrow strip of treaty ground it sat on were part of a bargain struck the previous October. The Indian agent, a rat-faced man named Howell, who smiled too much and whose breath always carried the sour smell of cheap whiskey, had come to the Lakota winter camp with an offer: stay close to Willow Springs trade. Peacefully do not interfere with the railroad survey crews, and in return the band could use this land for shelter and draw limited rations from the agency stores. It was a thin deal, but winter killed more people than bullets. Liesel's road west had been paved with lies. She had come on a freight wagon carrying women who had nowhere else to go. Her intended was a German farmer named Emil Bauer, who had filed a homestead claim on a river meadow 2 hard days' ride north. Before Liesel ever left Hamburg, Emil had arranged a proxy marriage legal papers signed in advance, binding them as husband and wife. If Emil died before she arrived, she would inherit the land. Emil had died on November 9th, 1877, 23 days before Liesel reached Willow Springs. A mine tunnel had collapsed at Cinder Bluff, burying him under 1,000 tons of rock. Silas Kral had been hired to haul Emil's trunk back to town. He opened it on the ride back, prying up the lock when no one was looking. Inside, among the clothes and seed catalogs, he found the proxy marriage certificate dated March 14th, 1877, and the homestead patent approved April 2nd, 1877. He understood immediately what those papers meant. If Liesel claimed the land, she would own prime bottomland in the path of the railroad worth thousands. If she stayed ignorant, he could steal it. So Silas lied. He told Liesel that Emil had died with no papers. He had her sign a receipt in English she could barely read, then turned it into an indenture contract. He kept the marriage certificate and homestead patent hidden in a strongbox under his office floor. Liesel's hearing had been damaged by scarlet fever when she was 7. She could hear loud sounds, a gunshot, a shout, but voices were muffled. She had learned to read lips to guess meaning from context. When she once answered too quickly, Silas beat her and told everyone she was deaf and simple. Being thought useless kept most men's hands off her. Hayamovi had suspected the truth 6 days before the dollar transaction on January 1st. He had seen her dodge a bolting horse with perfect timing. No one truly deaf could have reacted that way. Now, as they worked together to fix the stove, bracing the hot pipe while wedging stones beneath it, their shoulders pressed together, breaths synchronized, moving in desperate unison to keep from burning or freezing. It was the first intimacy born of pure survival. Over the next 10 days, January 7th through January 16th, a fragile routine took shape. Liesl learned to haul water to bank coals to move quietly through the camp. Hayamovi's cousin Ryan, a fierce woman who had lost her husband Chaska to pneumonia the previous winter, showed her how to stack wood and scrape hides. Ryan had no patience for white people's problems, but she respected competence. In town, Silas grumbled into his whiskey. Marshal Pike watched with calculating eyes. Black Tom watched both of them, sensing opportunity. He had a way of appearing in doorways when men were counting money, of lingering near conversations about strong boxes and hidden ledgers. He never asked questions. He just watched and waited and remembered. On January 11th, Hayamovi tested Liesl. In the general store, he accidentally dropped a horseshoe. It rang against the floor like a bell. Liesl's shoulders jerked before she could stop herself. That night across the small table, Hayamovi spoke carefully. "You hear some things. Not everything, but enough." After a long silence, Liesl answered in a rough, accented voice. "Enough to stay alive. Enough to get killed if the wrong men know." "Why did you let them think you were deaf?" She looked at her scarred hands. "Silas beat me when I answered too fast once. After that, I stayed silent. Men leave alone what they think is broken. You are not broken." Her eyes were hard cold. "No. But I learned to pretend." "Then tell me what you know." Over the next evenings, Liesl told him everything. She described nights in Silas's barn, her ear pressed to cracks in the wall, listening to Silas Pike and Agent Howell argue over money. They kept a ledger, a record of government shipments. The amounts written and the amounts delivered never matched. They sold the rest and split the profits. "Pike wanted to burn the book," Liesl said. Silas refused. He said it was his insurance. If Pike tried to kill him, the book would go to Washington. He said, "No honor between thieves, Marshal." "Where does he keep it?" "Under the floor in his office, in a strongbox." She pulled a scrap of paper from her pocket, a torn corner with part of a name, Emil Bauer, and a date fragment, March 14th, 187. "I found this in the ash bucket." Silas burned papers. This piece fell out. Hayamovi understood. Liesl was not just trapped in debt. She was a threat to a land grab. The marriage papers and the ledger were both in that strongbox. He made his choice. "We take it. We bring it to someone who can use it. Silas will kill us. He will try." Hayamovi knew only one person who might help Dr. Abigail Carter. She was a widow in her mid-40s, lean and raw-boned with iron-gray hair and a tongue that could strip paint. She had come west after her husband died of cholera, carrying nothing but medical instruments and a refusal to suffer fools. She treated anyone who could pay, and many who could not. She had set bones for Lakota children when other doctors refused. On January 16th, Hayamovi found her in her clinic. The room smelled of carbolic acid and old blood. She was stitching a ranch hand named Deacon, who had caught himself on barbed wire. When Deacon left, she turned sharp eyes on Hayamovi. "You look like a man with trouble." He told her everything. Dr. Carter listened without interrupting her hands, cleaning instruments with practiced efficiency. When he finished, she smiled thin, predatory. About time someone did something. She laid out a plan. On January 19th, Hayamovi would come to town, openly trading hides. Liesel would slip into Silas's office through a loose board in back, take the ledger and papers, and bring them to Dr. Carter. She would copy the key pages and telegraph a federal judge in Tombstone Ridge, Judge Marcus Collier, who owed her favors. "It is dangerous," Dr. Carter said, looking at Liesel. "If Silas catches you, he will kill you." "I know," Liesel said. "I am tired of being afraid." Dr. Carter nodded. "Then we move in 3 days." But there was a complication. Oscar Müller, a 19-year-old blacksmith's apprentice from Bavaria. He was slight, dark-haired, lonely. He had come to the camp twice, bringing repair work, speaking to Liesel in German, slipping her bread. He admired Hayamovi's quiet strength and had begun to hope foolishly, dangerously, that he might belong somewhere. On the evening of January 17th, Pike cornered Oscar in the smithy. He closed the door, trapping him. He set a rifle cartridge on the anvil with a soft click that seemed to echo in the silence. "You have been spending time with Indians," Pike said, voice soft and dangerous. "I do work for them, honest work. You know what happens to foreigners who pick the wrong side." Pike leaned close, his breath hot and sour. "Vigilance committees find a tree and a rope. You are not a citizen, boy. You are here because we let you be here." Pike gave him orders. Watch the warrior report any plans, and when the time came, led Pike's men to the camp. "You do that, you stay safe. You cross me." He tapped the cartridge with one yellowed fingernail. "You hang." Oscar nodded, pale and shaking, his conscience already at war with his fear. The theft was set for Wednesday afternoon, January 19th. The weather had turned colder, the sky promising snow. Hayamovi rode into Willow Springs just after noon on a paint pony leading a pack horse loaded with hides and venison. He made his way to the general store, asking loud questions about coffee and ammunition. He wanted everyone to see him. Across the street, Liesel slipped into the alley behind the freight yard. She wore a dark shawl and moved like someone beneath notice. She counted steps and stopped at the third window. The plank covering it was held by a single bent nail she had loosened weeks ago. She pried it out, squeezed through the narrow gap, and dropped silently into Silas's office. The room was dim, smelling of stale smoke and whiskey. Her heart hammered so loud, she thought it would give her away. She forced herself to breathe slowly and moved to the corner. The loose floorboard was marked by a knothole shaped like a teardrop. She pried it up. Beneath it was the strongbox. She jammed a bent nail into the padlock and twisted hard. The lock clicked open. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was the ledger, thick, leather-bound damning. She opened it just long enough to see the columns of stolen shipments. Tucked in the back was a packet, the proxy marriage certificate and the homestead patent. She stuffed both into a cloth sack and stood turning toward the window. The door slammed open. Silas filled the doorway, shotgun raised. "That ledger is my insurance, girl. You think I am letting you walk out with my neck in your hands?" He raised the shotgun finger, tightening on the trigger. Across the street, Hayamovi saw movement through the grimy window. He saw two shapes, one massive, one small, and the unmistakable profile of a shotgun being raised. Instinct exploded through him like a lightning strike. He dropped the bundle of hides, ignored the storekeeper's startled shout, and sprinted across the muddy street. A freight wagon swerved, the driver cursing. Hayamovi did not slow. He hit the office door with his shoulder, the latch splintering inward, and threw himself through the opening just as Silas's finger began to squeeze the trigger. The shotgun's roar was like thunder trapped in a box. The blast tore into the ceiling, ripping through thin boards and plaster, sending a rain of splinters and mouse nests cascading down. Hayamovi slammed into Silas, with the full momentum of his sprint driving his shoulder into the bigger man's ribs. The impact knocked the wind out of Silas and sent the shotgun flying. It clattered against the wall and discharged the second barrel into the floor, blowing a fist-sized hole through the planks and filling the room with acrid smoke. A kerosene lantern, knocked from its hook by the concussion, tumbled to the floor and shattered. Burning oil spread across the wooden planks in a bright, hungry sheet. Flames licked up the wall, catching on an oiled cloth hanging there. Liesl did not freeze. She kicked the burning cloth down and stamped on it once, twice, 3 times, ignoring the searing pain as embers bit through her boot. She ground the flames out, leaving only smoldering fabric and choking smoke. Outside, Glass-Eye Joe, a half-drunk teamster with a milky left eye and a grudge against anyone darker than saddle leather, leveled a rifle through the shattered window. Liesl saw the movement, saw the dull gleam of steel. She threw her weight against Hayamovi's back, knocking him sideways. The rifle cracked like a whip. The bullet missed Hayamovi's head by inches and smashed into the telegraph sounder on the desk, sending sparks and twisted brass flying. Dr. Abigail Carter, waiting across the street under the pretense of shopping, appeared in the doorway. She took in the scene in one sweeping glance, Silas on the floor, gasping for air. Liesl clutching the sack, Glass-Eye Joe reloading, and moved with surgical efficiency. She stepped over broken glass, and while Marshal Pike came running from down the street shouting threats, Dr. Carter bent as if to steady herself against the doorframe, hooked the cloth sack with her boot, and moments later walked calmly away, with the ledger and marriage papers hidden beneath her heavy skirts. By the time Pike burst through the door, revolver drawn and eyes wild, the evidence was gone. That night, January 19th, Silas and Pike drank whiskey in the Lucky Dollar's back room. The air was thick with cigar smoke and fury. Black Tom sat alone at a corner table in the main saloon, nursing a bottle of cheap corn whiskey positioned where the thin wall allowed him to hear every word. "If that ledger reaches a judge, we hang." Pike said, his bandaged hand shaking as he poured another glass. "Howell will run, but us, we are finished." "You think I do not know that?" Silas snarled, slamming his glass down hard enough to crack it. "You wanted to burn it months ago. I kept it because the minute I did not have insurance, you would put a bullet in my back. And now it will hang us both." Pike's face was hard as stone. "We go to that camp tonight. We take the girl, get the book, and burn that place to the ground. No witnesses, no evidence." "I will get men," Pike said. 1 hour. Through the wall, Black Tom's smile widened. He had been waiting for this, the moment when desperate men stopped thinking and started making mistakes. He knew Pike kept a roll of emergency cash in his vest, money skimmed from fines and shakedowns. He knew Silas carried his share of the stolen proceeds in a leather pouch on his belt, because Silas trusted no one enough to leave it anywhere else. When things turned ugly tonight, Black Tom would position himself to walk away richer than either of them. Loyalty, he had learned long ago, was just another word for the price a man hadn't yet been offered. Pike assembled his men by midnight, Glass-Eye Joe, nursing his bruised ego and spoiling for a fight. Deacon and Cully both owing Pike money and unable to refuse. And Black Tom, who came for $2 in a bottle and his own reasons. And Oscar. Pike dragged the boy from his cot in the room behind the smithy, revolver pressed to his temple hard enough to leave a circular bruise. "You lead us to that cabin. You keep quiet. You do what I say, or I blow your head off right here and tell everyone you tried to steal from me." Oscar's face was white as chalk, his hands trembling. He thought of Liesl's tired face when he had brought her bread, the way she had smiled and thanked him in their shared language. He thought of the Lakota children who had watched him work with curious eyes, and he thought of the rope. "I understand," he whispered. They rode out at midnight, January 20th, with a storm building on the northern horizon, like a wall of iron. At the camp, Rayen was checking the horses when she saw tracks in the snow. Boot tracks, not moccasins. Horses shod with iron nails. At least 5, maybe 6, headed this way from town. Fresh tracks no more than an hour old. She ran back to find Hayamovi splitting wood near the cabin. "Riders coming," she said in rapid Lakota, her breath steaming. "White men. 5 or more. Close." Hayamovi set down the axe, his hand moving instinctively to check the knife at his belt. He looked toward the tree line, listening. The wind was rising, carrying the scent of snow. "Bring the children into the cabin. 2 strikes. Dr. Carter, if she's here. Anyone who cannot fight." Rayan's eyes flashed with anger. "This is your fight. Your white woman brought this on us. Why should we risk our children?" "Because they will not stop with her," Hayamovi said quietly, meeting her gaze without flinching. "They want us gone. They want the land, the rations, everything. If we do not stand now, we die piece by piece." Rayan stared at him for a long moment, jaw tight, then gave a sharp nod. "Then we stand. But if we lose people tonight, their blood is on your hands." "I know," Hayamovi said. "I will carry it." The blizzard came with terrifying speed. One moment the sky was heavy and gray, the air still and expectant. The next the temperature plummeted, wind rose to a shriek, and snow fell in blinding curtains that turned the world into a white, howling chaos. Within half an hour, a man could not see his own hand, held at arm's length. Pike's posse reached the timber's edge just as the storm hit full force. Horses reared and screamed, fighting the bits. Men cursed, wrapping scarves around faces that were already going numb. Oscar, riding near Pike with his hands bound to the saddle horn, could barely see the horse in front of him through the driving white. "Keep moving," Pike bellowed, his voice nearly lost in the wind. "Finish this tonight, or we all hang." At the camp, women pulled children into teepees, driving stakes deeper, lashing hides tighter against the wind that threatened to tear everything apart. Men scrambled to secure horses that rolled their eyes and pulled at their tethers. Hayamovi moved through the chaos, pulling the vulnerable into the cabin. Liesl, Rayan, 3 small children, including a 4-year-old girl named Winona, with eyes like dark water, old 2 strikes, who could barely walk but refused to die lying down. And Dr. Carter, who had ridden out that morning with a warning and a rifle. Hayamovi barred the door with 2 heavy timbers. The stove glowed red in the dimness, barely holding back the cold that pressed in from every side. Frost formed on the inside of the door in delicate, deadly patterns. Everyone huddled close, breath steaming, listening to the storm's fury. Through the wind's howl came other sounds, shouts, metal clanging, a horse's frightened whinny, and then sharp and unmistakable, a rifle's crack. A bullet punched through the oiled paper window with a sound like tearing cloth shattering the fragile frame. Another followed then, another hammering the log walls with brutal efficiency. Splinters flew. Little Winona screamed a high, terrified sound. Rayan clamped a hand over her mouth, whispering fiercely in Lakota for her to be silent, to be brave. Hayamovi and Rayan flipped the table and dragged it to the window. They wedged it into place and shoved rifle barrels into the gap beneath. Hayamovi fired blind into the storm muzzle flash, lighting the cabin in brief orange bursts that left purple afterimages. Rayan worked her Springfield with grim efficiency, ejecting spent cartridges and reloading with hands that did not shake. Outside, a horse went down screaming, its leg broken in a hidden drift. Cully was thrown hard, the terrified animal rolling over his leg with the full weight of its body. His shouts were swallowed by the wind, becoming just another sound in the storm's cacophony. Smoke backed up from the stove as wind drove snow and ice down the makeshift chimney. The cabin filled with choking gray haze that burned eyes and throats. Dr. Carter shouted for everyone to get down, her voice cutting through the chaos. Liesl crawled to the stove hands, wrapped in wet cloth that steamed and scorched. She and Hayamovi worked together, shoulders locked, breaths synchronized, moving with the unspoken coordination of two people who had learned to survive together. Easing the stove door open to vent smoke without extinguishing the fire they needed to live. The door shifted with a metallic groan. Smoke roared up through the pipe. Freezing air rushed in through every crack and gap, but they could breathe again. Outside, Pike forced Oscar around back toward the cabin's blind side, shoving a dented kerosene can at him and thrusting a lantern into his shaking hands. Snow had already frozen in Oscar's eyebrows and the stubble on his jaw. "Soak the logs!" Pike snarled, his face twisted with desperation. "Light it, smoke them out, or burn them alive. I do not care which—" Oscar's hands trembled so violently he could barely grip the can. He splashed kerosene against the frozen logs, the liquid freezing in streaks almost as fast as he poured it. He lifted the lantern, the flame guttering in the wind, and his fingers hovered over the glass, one motion away from dropping it, from turning the cabin into an inferno. Through the storm's roar, muffled by wind and walls, he heard a sound from inside, a child crying, and a woman's voice. Liesel's voice speaking softly in German, the language of home and memory, telling the child everything would be all right, that she should not be afraid. Oscar froze, lantern half raised. In that moment, time seemed to stretch. He could light the fire and save himself. Watch the cabin burn, watch the people inside die screaming and walk away with his life. Or he could refuse and die here in the snow, far from home, far from everything he had known. He made his choice. He hurled the lantern into a snowdrift, where it shattered harmlessly in a brief flare of orange that the storm swallowed instantly. Then he turned to face Pike, his thin body straightening despite the cold and fear, and shouted with all the strength he had left. "No, I will not burn children. I will not." Pike's face twisted with rage. He raised his revolver and fired. The shot went wild, the bullet whining off into the darkness. Oscar did not run. He stood his ground and began shouting warnings in two languages. German for Liesel, broken English for the others, calling out positions, directions, anything that might help them survive. Hayamovi heard the shouts. He slipped out through the narrow gap at the cabin's back, dropping into snow that came up to his thighs and circled through the whiteout with the silent efficiency of a man who had hunted in worse conditions. He saw Pike's shape, a darker shadow against the white, and tackled him from the side, just as the marshal squeezed the trigger again. The shot went high, lost in the storm's fury. They went down in a tangle of limbs, rolling and struggling in snow so deep it threatened to suffocate them both. At the front of the cabin, Silas and Deacon threw their shoulders against the door, trying to smash it open. Each impact knocked Liesel backward, boots slipping on the packed earth floor. She braced herself alone, back against the door arms, shaking with the strain. The weight of two grown men was too much. The timbers groaned. The leather hinges stretched. "Hold the door!" Rayan shouted, still firing through the gap. "I am trying." Liesel gasped, feeling the door shudder with each blow. Every impact felt like it would shatter not just the door, but her bones, her resolve, everything that held her together. Deacon, his face red with exertion and whiskey courage, slipped on a patch of ice hidden beneath the snow. His boot twisted at an unnatural angle. Bone cracked with a wet snap that was audible even over the wind. He went down screaming, clutching his shattered ankle, his cries high and animal. Silas, suddenly alone, threw himself at the door one more time with all his considerable weight. It shuddered violently, but held. He staggered back, blood streaming from a gash on his forehead where the door's edge had caught him, mixing with the snow on his face. Behind the cabin, Pike broke free from Hayamovi's grip and lunged for his revolver, half buried in the snow where it had fallen. His fingers closed around the grip. He came up gasping, swinging the weapon toward Hayamovi's chest at point-blank range. Oscar saw it happening. Time seemed to slow, each moment stretching like taffy. He saw the gun coming up, saw Pike's finger tightening on the trigger, saw Hayamovi off balance and vulnerable. In that crystallized instant, Oscar understood with absolute clarity that he could do one good thing with his life. One thing that would matter. He threw himself forward into the space between the gun and the man he admired, into the line of fire. The revolver roared the sound flat and final in the snow-deadened air. The bullet caught Oscar high in the chest, just below the left collarbone, angling downward. The impact spun him halfway around and dropped him into the snow. He lay on his back, staring up at the swirling white sky, watching snowflakes fall toward his face like tiny stars. Blood spread across his coat in a dark stain that steamed in the cold, melting the snow beneath him into pink slush. Hayamovi lunged forward and drove his fist into Pike's jaw with every ounce of strength and fury he possessed. Pike's head snapped back, his eyes rolled up. He went down hard unconscious before he hit the ground. Hayamovi dropped to his knees beside Oscar, hands hovering over the wound, knowing even as he pressed down that it was mortal. "You fool, you fool. Why?" Oscar coughed, blood flecking his lips and running from the corner of his mouth. His breathing was wet, labored. "Could not let him shoot you." Each word was a struggle. "Could not burn children." His eyes, already glazing, found Hayamovi's face. "Tell Liesel I tried to be good." "You are good," Hayamovi said, his voice breaking. "You are better than any of us." But Oscar did not hear, his eyes fixed on something above, something only he could see. His chest rose once more, shallow and stuttering, and then fell and did not rise again. The snowflakes settled on his open eyes, melting on the last warmth that remained. At the front of the cabin, glass-eyed, Joe saw Pike go down and Oscar fall. He broke and ran, vanishing into the storm like a ghost, his courage fleeing with him. But the fight was not over. A young Lakota warrior named Dakota, barely 17 summers old, with the smooth face of youth and the fierce heart of his ancestors, had been circling the cabin's far side, trying to flank the attackers. He was Ryan's nephew, the son of her younger brother, who had died of smallpox 5 winters past. She had helped raise him, had taught him to track and hunt, had braided his hair when he was small. He emerged from behind the woodpile, just as Black Tom, cold and calculating even in the chaos, raised his rifle with professional efficiency. Black Tom saw the movement, a shape materializing from the white, and fired without hesitation, without conscience, without a flicker of humanity. The bullet caught Dakota in the throat, tearing through flesh and artery. The boy went down hard, both hands clutching the wound, as blood pumped between his fingers in rhythmic spurts that matched the panicked beating of his heart. His eyes were wide with shock and confusion, unable to comprehend the suddenness of dying. Rayen saw him fall. She screamed his name, "Dakota!" The sound raw and primal, the cry of a mother watching her child die. She threw herself out the cabin door, rifle still in hand, racing toward him through snow that grabbed at her legs and slowed her down when speed was everything. Black Tom was already reloading with practiced hands, smooth and mechanical as a machine. He raised his rifle again, tracking the running woman, calculating the lead he needed for a moving target. Dr. Abigail Carter saw it from the cabin window. She grabbed her medical bag and bolted after Rayen, shouting with all the authority of a woman who had commanded death to wait many times before, "No, get down." Rayen reached Dakota and threw herself over his body, shielding him with her own, her hand pressing desperately against the wound, even though she could feel his life pulsing out between her fingers. Black Tom's rifle cracked. The bullet meant for Rayen's head hit her high in the shoulder, instead spinning her sideways. She fell across Dakota, her blood mixing with his red against white. Dr. Carter reached them seconds later, sliding to her knees in the bloody snow. "Do not move," she shouted at Rayan, already pressing her hands against Dakota's throat. But blood pulsed between her fingers with terrible force, hot and slick and unstoppable. She knew with the cold certainty of years watching people die that the bullet had severed the carotid artery. The boy's eyes were already losing focus, staring past her at the storm-dark sky. "Stay with me," Dr. Carter commanded, pressing harder, as if will alone could keep him alive. "Dakota, stay with me." But the boy's lips were already turning blue. His chest rose once, twice, each breath shallower than the last. His hand slipped away from the wound, falling limp into the snow. The light went out of his eyes like a candle in wind there, one moment gone the next, leaving only the empty shell of what had been a living boy with dreams and fears and a whole unlived life ahead of him. The blood stopped pulsing. His body went still. "No," Rayan whispered, her voice breaking. "No, no, no." Black Tom chambered another round, taking aim at the doctor's back, ready to finish what he had started. Hayamovi saw it happening. He snatched up Pike's dropped revolver, raised it with both hands to steady his aim, and fired from 40 yards away, through driving snow and tears and rage. The shot went wide, kicking up snow 2 feet to Black Tom's left. He fired again. The bullet whined past Black Tom's head, close enough to make him flinch. Black Tom made his calculation in that instant, the arithmetic of survival that had kept him alive this long. Pike was down. Silas was bleeding and broken. The job had gone bad. The smart move was to cut his losses and save himself. But not empty-handed. Never empty-handed. He swung his rifle toward Silas, who was stumbling through the snow toward where the horses were tethered, one hand pressed to his bleeding forehead. "Sorry, old man," Black Tom said without a trace of emotion. "Nothing personal, just business." He fired. The bullet caught Silas squarely in the back, punching through his lung and out the front of his chest in a spray of blood and bone. Silas went down face first in the snow, gasping like a landed fish, each breath a wet, rattling struggle. Blood spread beneath him in a widening pool that steamed in the cold. Black Tom ran to the dying man, dropped to one knee, and rifled through Silas's coat pockets with the efficiency of long practice. He found a folded packet of papers, the duplicate record Silas had kept as insurance against Pike, and the heavy leather pouch from Silas's belt coins clinking inside with the sweet sound of freedom. Black Tom stuffed both into his own coat, grabbed Silas's horse by the reins, and swung up into the saddle. He looked back once at the carnage bodies in the snow blood and smoke and chaos and felt nothing. Then he spurred the horse and vanished into the storm like smoke, riding toward a future bought with other men's blood and gold. By the time anyone could think of pursuit, he was gone, swallowed by the white, howling wilderness, as if he had never existed at all. When dawn broke through the thinning storm edges, the world was silent except for the creak of settling snow and the distant call of a crow. The Lakota camp was battered but standing. Bodies lay covered in blankets and snow. Dakota was dead. The bullet had severed his carotid artery, and he had bled out in less than a minute, his young blood painting the snow crimson around him. They found him with Rayan still lying across his body, her face pressed against his shoulder, weeping without sound. Rayan's shot through the shoulder had survived, only because Dr. Carter had been fast enough to pack the wound and tie it off before she bled to death. She would live, but she would carry that scar and that grief for the rest of her days. Part of her had died with Dakota in the snow, and everyone could see it in her eyes. Oscar lay near the back of the cabin, his face pale as candle wax, peaceful in death. Dr. Carter had done everything she could, dug out the bullet, packed the wound, given him laudanum for the pain. But the bullet had nicked something vital deep inside. He had been bleeding internally, drowning slowly in his own blood. She had known from the start he would not last the day. Liesl knelt beside him as the gray dawn light filtered through the thinning clouds, holding his cold hand in both of hers, speaking softly in German. "Du warst tapfer." She whispered, tears freezing on her cheeks. "You were brave. You saved us all. You are a hero. Your mother would be proud." Oscar had died just before noon, with Liesl holding his hand and speaking to him in the language of home, and Ryan wounded but refusing to rest, standing nearby with her head bowed in respect for a boy who had chosen honor over survival. Hayamovi had injuries too. During the fight with Pike, he had taken a glancing blow to the head that had opened a gash above his left eye, and Pike's boot had caught him hard in the ribs, cracking at least 2 of them. He moved carefully, breathing shallowly, each inhalation a sharp reminder. But he would not rest. There was too much to do. The dead needed tending. The living needed shelter. And there would be a reckoning. They buried Oscar that afternoon in the frozen ground at the edge of the camp. Hayamovi and 2 Lakota men, Strong Hand and Walking Bear, dug the grave with picks and shovels, breaking through frost-hardened earth 1 agonizing inch at a time. It took 4 hours. Dr. Carter read a short prayer in English, her voice steady and clear. "Lord, receive this young man who gave his life for others. He was braver than most men, twice his age, and kinder than this world deserved. May he rest in peace." It was honest, and it was more than most men got. They placed Dakota's body on a burial scaffold in the cottonwoods, wrapped in the best buffalo hide they had left painted with red ochre and tied with leather cords so the wind and sky could carry his spirit home to his ancestors. Ryan stood beneath the platform for a long time, one hand pressed to her wounded shoulder, staring up at the bundle that held all that remained of the boy she had loved as a son. Outside the cabin, Silas Crawl lay face down where he had fallen dead from Black Tom's bullet, his blood long since frozen into the snow. Deacon, his ankle shattered, lay nearby, moaning and delirious with pain and cold. Pike lay unconscious, wrists bound with rawhide, a lump on his jaw, the size of a hen's egg and dark as a bruise. In the days that followed January 21st through the end of the month, Willow Springs struggled to dig itself out from under 2 feet of snow. The Lakota mourned properly with songs and silence, with grief given its due weight. Dr. Carter tended the wounded, accepting no complaints, no excuses, no payment from those who could not afford it. On January 23rd, Dr. Carter retrieved the ledger and marriage papers from their hiding place in her clinic, tucked inside a hollowed medical text on the shelf where no one would think to look. She spent 3 nights by lamplight, copying the most damning entries, dates, names forged, signatures, amounts stolen. She copied the marriage certificate and homestead patent word for word. Then she wrote a detailed letter to Judge Marcus Collier in Tombstone Ridge, a man who owed her his life from a surgery she had performed 3 years back, and sent it by trusted courier, willing to ride through winter for triple pay. She also sent a telegraph to the federal marshal's office. Evidence secured. Immediate action required. Murder. Fraud. Witness testimony available. A. Carter, Willow Springs. The message reached Tombstone Ridge on January 25th. Judge Collier, a lean man with steel-gray hair and eyes that missed nothing, read Dr. Carter's letter and dispatched 2 federal marshals, Garrett and Stone, to Willow Springs with orders to investigate and arrest. They arrived February 10th, 3 weeks after the blizzard, riding in on horses with ice in their manes. They held preliminary hearings in the Lucky Dollar Saloon, the only space large enough to accommodate everyone who wanted to watch justice or something like it being done. On the morning of February 12th, Liesl testified first. Her voice was rough but steady, her English accented but clear. She described the nights in Silas's barn, her ear pressed to cracks in the wall, listening to 3 men divide stolen goods and argue over money. She repeated Silas's exact words about the ledger being his life insurance against Pike putting a bullet in my back. Dr. Carter presented the ledger itself, along with her meticulous notes, showing discrepancies between government shipment records and actual deliveries. Hundreds of pounds of flour beef blankets and medicine, all paid for, all supposedly delivered, all vanished. She presented the marriage certificate dated March 14, 1877, and the homestead patent dated April 2, 1997, proving Liesel's legal claim. Rayan, her arm in a sling and her face carved from stone, testified about receiving short rations for 2 years, about spoiled food, and thin blankets about watching children go hungry while white men grew fat. 2 Strikes testified about broken promises, about treaties signed and forgotten, about being told to be grateful for scraps. Hayamovi testified about the attack, about Pike's threats, about Oscar's sacrifice, and Takota's murder. Marshal Garrett, a man who had seen enough frontier corruption to fill a courthouse, issued arrest warrants immediately. Pike and Deacon were shackled and transported to Tombstone Ridge under armed guard. Warrants were issued for Agent Howell and Black Tom, both vanished like morning mist. The trial was held in late March 1878, as the snow finally began to melt, and the first green shoots pushed through the black earth. Reginald Pike was tried on charges of fraud theft, of government property conspiracy, and conspiracy to commit murder. The ledger was entered as Exhibit A Liesel. Dr. Carter, Rayan, and Hayamovi made the 3-day journey to Tombstone Ridge to testify again, and their words recorded by a court stenographer who struggled to keep up. The jury, 12 men ranging from shopkeepers to ranchers, deliberated 4 hours. Pike was found guilty on all counts and sentenced to 20 years hard labor in the Wyoming Territorial Prison at Laramie, a grim stone place where the wind never stopped and the winters punished men who thought they were tough. Deacon, convicted as an accessory, received 8 years in the same prison. Silas Krall, already dead and frozen in the ground, was posthumously convicted in the court record, a symbolic judgment, but one that mattered to those he had wronged. His estate, such as it was liquidated to pay partial restitution. Agent Howell was never caught. Rumor placed him in San Francisco, then Denver, then nowhere at all. The warrant remained active for 20 years before being officially closed. Black Tom disappeared into the territories with Silas's blood money and was never seen again in Willow Springs. Some said he died in a gunfight outside Dodge City. Others swore they saw him years later in Deadwood, older and meaner, still wearing 2 guns. The truth died with him, wherever and whenever that was. By early April, spring was transforming the prairie from white to gold to green. Ice broke on the river with sounds like distant cannon fire, massive sheets grinding against each other and piling up in frozen chaos before the current finally won and swept them away. Green grass pushed through black earth. Wildflowers, Indian paintbrush, and prairie rose began to bloom. The air smelled of wet soil and new growth and possibility. On the morning of April 18th, a clerk named Pruitt from the Territorial Land Office arrived at the camp, riding a nervous bay mare and carrying a leather satchel. He was young, perhaps 25, nervous with ink stains on his fingers and spectacles that kept sliding down his nose. "Miss Liesel Bauer," he said, dismounting carefully. Liesel stepped forward from where she had been hanging wash. Hayamovi, moving cautiously because of his still healing ribs, stood beside her. "Yes." Pruitt adjusted his spectacles and cleared his throat. "The Territorial Office has completed its review of your case. The proxy marriage between you and Emil Bauer, executed March 14, 1877 in Hamburg, Germany, and registered with the United States Consulate, has been verified as legal and binding. The homestead patent approved April 2, 1977, listed both you and Emil Bauer as joint owners. Under the Homestead Act of 1862, as surviving spouse, you are sole legal owner of 160 acres of improved land along Willow Creek, including riparian rights, mineral rights, and all structures thereon. He handed her a thick envelope containing the marriage certificate, the patent, and an official confirmation letter bearing the territorial seal. Liesl stared at the papers as if they might vanish if she looked away. Tears blurred her vision. Dr. Carter, who had ridden out for the occasion, stepped forward and explained clearly, in both English and German, "The land is yours. All of it. 160 acres. No one can take it from you. Not the railroad, not the territory, not anyone." Pruitt shifted his weight uncomfortably, clearly uncomfortable with the display of emotion. "I should inform you that several railroad surveyors and land speculators have already expressed interest in purchasing. The amounts being discussed are substantial, upwards of $3,000. $3,000. A fortune. Enough to go back east to start over somewhere civilized, somewhere without snow and bullets and grief." Liesl looked at the papers, then at Hyamovi. She thought of the winter, the smoke and cold, and the night they fixed the stove together, shoulders pressed close, working in desperate synchrony. She thought of Rayen teaching her to scrape hides to bank a fire to survive. She thought of 2 Strikes sharing his last bit of jerky without being asked. She thought of Oscar throwing himself between Hyamovi and Pike's gun of his last words, asking her to tell his mother he had tried to be good. She thought of young Lakota bleeding out in the snow and Rayen's silent, broken weeping. "I do not want to sell," she said clearly, her voice steady. Pruitt blinked rapidly. "I beg your pardon. I do not want to sell the land. I want it put in writing and recorded." She looked at Dr. Carter, who nodded encouragingly. "The deed stays in my name. But there will be a written covenant stating that Hyamovi's band may use this cabin and meadow as winter shelter and trading ground. No sale, no lease, and no change to those terms, without notice to the band elders and their consent witnessed in town. I want it plain lawful and recorded so no man can pretend he did not know." Pruitt looked bewildered, his mouth opening and closing like a fish. "Miss Bauer, with all due respect, you could sell this property for enough money to live comfortably for years. You could return east. You could—" "I know," Liesl interrupted quietly. "But money is not everything. This land was meant for a family. I found my family here. This is where I stay." Judge Collier, who had traveled from Tombstone Ridge to oversee the final resolutions and ensure justice was properly served, reviewed the recorded covenant that Dr. Carter and a territorial lawyer drafted over the next 2 days. He approved it with his signature and seal, then ordered it filed with the county recorder and noted in the territorial court record on April 18, 1878. The papers were signed and witnessed by Dr. Carter and Marshall Garrett. The cabin and meadow remained in Liesl's name, but the agreement made the band's right of use unmistakable, and it could not be altered without a fresh filing and the elders' consent. In the weeks that followed, as spring turned the prairie from green to gold, as the river ran clear and fast and alive, Hyamovi and Liesl worked side by side. They reinforced the cabin's foundation with river stones. He lifted the heavy stones. She packed the gaps with clay mixed with prairie grass. When a wagon arrived in late May with a proper cast-iron stove and pipe paid for by the town council after Judge Collier's pointed remarks about civic responsibility and the moral weight of recent events, Hyamovi positioned himself between Liesl and the wagon's mud splash. Without thinking about it, she reached around him to steady a shifting crate, her hand resting on his shoulder briefly, the touch as natural as breathing. They did not speak of love like poets did in the novels that sometimes found their way west. Their bond was written in shared work and survival, in the language of calloused hands and knowing glances. He learned to stand on her weaker hearing side in crowds, to speak clearly and face her when he had something important to say. She learned to tap his arm twice before someone approached from behind, giving him time to prepare to shift from private man to public warrior. He could read the tilt of her head when she struggled to follow a conversation in English. She could read the tension in his shoulders when he needed someone at his back and not in his face. One evening in mid-May, while Hayamovi was recovering from a day of heavy work that had aggravated his healing ribs, Dr. Carter came to check his progress. She unwrapped the bandages, her hands efficient but not unkind, and examined the purple-yellow bruises that still mottled his side. "You are lucky," she said, rewrapping his ribs with fresh linen. "Another inch to the left, and that kick would have punctured your lung. You would have drowned in your own blood in about 3 minutes. Not a good way to go." "I have been lucky before," Hayamovi said quietly, watching Liesel through the window as she worked in the small garden they had started. "Luck runs out." Dr. Carter tied off the bandage with a firm knot. "But stubbornness, that lasts." She glanced toward the window, following his gaze. "You two have something rare. Something most people spend their whole lives looking for and never find. Do not waste it trying to be something you are not. Just be." Liesel had looked up from her mending by the stove, meeting Dr. Carter's eyes across the room, then Hayamovi's. No words were spoken, but understanding passed between all three of them, and the recognition that some bonds cannot be named or categorized, only lived. 2 Strikes, the old hunter, whose hands were gnarled with arthritis, but whose eyes were still sharp, pulled Hayamovi aside one morning before dawn. They stood together, watching the sun break over the eastern horizon, painting the prairie in shades of rose and gold. "You took a great risk for her," 2 Strikes said in Lakota, his weathered face thoughtful. "Some in the camp say you put white concerns above your people, that you brought danger to us for a woman who is not even one of us." "I put truth above lies," Hayamovi replied, his voice firm. "And justice above theft. The fight was never just about her. It was about all of us, about whether we would let them take everything piece by piece or whether we would stand and say enough." 2 Strikes was silent for a long moment, watching the light spread across the land. Then he nodded slowly. "Your father would be proud. You have his courage and his wisdom. Do not doubt yourself, Takoja." For he used the formal term, grandson of the people, acknowledging Hayamovi's place, his worthiness, his belonging. Those words had stayed with Hayamovi through the trial, and after through the long nights of healing and the longer days of rebuilding. Now on a warm June evening, with the sun setting in bands of gold and crimson and deep purple, he and Liesel stood on the new porch they had built together, overlooking the meadow, where Lakota children played and horses grazed. The air smelled of wild roses and sage. The river sang its endless song. Hayamovi's hand rested on the smooth rail-planed pine that still smelled of fresh wood. Liesel's hand, scarred but strong, rested beside it, their fingers not quite touching but close enough to feel the warmth. "You could have left," Hayamovi said quietly, watching the light fade. "Sold the land. Gone back east. Started new somewhere and no one knew your story." "I could have," Liesel agreed, watching the children play some game with a leather ball and much laughter. "But I did not want to. I do not want to. This is where I belong now. This is home." He looked at her, really looked the way a man looks at something precious and hard-won, and saw not the frightened girl bought for $1 and freed the same day, but a woman who had survived and emerged stronger, fiercer, more fully alive than most people ever manage to be. "Yes," he said simply. "It is." She looked back, and in her eyes, he saw recognition. He was no longer just the warrior who tore up a contract in the snow, but a man she trusted with her life, whose quiet strength had given her the freedom to choose her own path. And he saw that she had chosen, was still choosing, would choose tomorrow and the day after. They stood in the fading light as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, not quite touching, but bound together by something deeper and more permanent than words, by survival, by choice, by the unshakable reality of two people who had decided to stand together when the world tried to tear them apart. Rayan recovered slowly from her shoulder wound, the injury healing with a puckered scar that would ache when storms came. But the wound to her spirit took longer. She found work in town, her skill with hides earning grudging respect from men who had previously ignored her. She and Dr. Carter became unlikely friends, two fierce women who understood loss and refused to be diminished by it. They met for coffee once a week in the clinic, speaking little, understanding much. The pain of losing Lakota never left Rayan, but she channeled her grief into ensuring no other child would die from stolen medicine or missing supplies. She became the band's voice in town, the one who would march into the agency office or the general store and demand accountability. And men learned not to lie to her face. Dr. Abigail Carter remained in Willow Springs for the rest of her life, her clinic always busy, always open. Her reputation spread far beyond the territory. She delivered babies white, Lakota, Mexican, Chinese, she did not care, set bones, treated fevers, performed surgeries on kitchen tables when necessary, and never turned away a patient who genuinely needed help. When she died in her sleep on a spring morning in 1901, at age 68, half the territory attended her funeral, and the line of people who came to stand by her grave and say thank you stretched a quarter mile. Oscar Miller was buried in the small cemetery outside town, his grave marked with a simple wooden cross that Hayamovi carved himself, burning the words into the wood with a hot iron. Oscar Miller, 1858-1878. Or Tapfer. He was brave. Liesel visited his grave every spring without fail, placing wildflowers on it and the same Indian paintbrush and prairie roses that grew wild on the land he had died to protect, and speaking to him in German, thanking him for his courage, telling him about the children who played in the meadow because he had refused to light a fire. Black Tom was never found. Rumors placed him in California, then the Black Hills, then Montana, then nowhere at all. Some said he died in a gunfight outside Dodge City in 1882. Others swore they saw him years later in Deadwood, older and meaner, wearing the same two guns and the same dead eyes, working as an enforcer for a cattle baron with more money than morals. The law eventually stopped looking. Black Tom had vanished like smoke with blood money in his pockets, and the frontier swallowed men like him every day without leaving a trace. The frontier remained brutal. More railroads came carving the prairie into sections and parcels. More treaties were broken, more land stolen, more people displaced. Winters still tested everyone who stayed, separating the stubborn from the sensible, the survivors from the dreamers. But on this particular patch of land, a cabin on treaty ground, a meadow held in trust 160 acres, where two different worlds had collided and somehow, against all odds, chosen not to destroy each other. A Lakota warrior and a German immigrant woman had built something that could not be measured in dollars or acres. They had built a refuge, a family, a bond forged not in romance or poetry, but in the unshakable reality of two people who chose to stand together when the world tried to tear them apart, who fixed a stove together on the coldest night of winter, who survived because they refused to do anything else. In the brutal arithmetic of the frontier in 1878, that was victory worth more than all the gold in California. Years later, when people asked Liesel, and they did ask because the story spread and grew, as all good stories do, how she and Hayamovi had come together, she would smile a small, quiet smile and say simply, "He bought me for $1 and tore up the contract. Everything after that we built together." And that was the truth, plain and unadorned, the way truth always is when you scrape away everything else and look at what remains: two people, a harsh land, and a choice to build rather than break. The rest was just living.